Hi, and welcome to this episode of Consciousness and Me. My name is Yusufit, and I thought today we would make a deep dive into the question of the hard problem of consciousness. So, the hard problem of consciousness is basically mm, a clearly defined question that's been around for very long, but it's been formulated by David Chalmers in 1995, and it centers in one of the big questions that hasn't been answered in the way we relate to the world. And it's basically, say, how does consciousness arise out of matter? What is the correlation? Or what is the relationship between them? In other words, in more practical terms, it basically means how does electrical impulses that is sent through our nervous systems and our brains, how does that give rise to our conscious experience? How does measurements that we do of my brain, different activity, how is that experienced as the color of red, or being in love, or thinking about my childhood? How do we map these two? And it's easy to think that we've already done that because we can see which areas are active when I feel fear. But when we look into it, we haven't really done that. What we can see is that they're correlated. Basically, when I feel fear, when I express that now I feel fear, you can see certain part of my brains light up. But the fact that they are related, it doesn't really explain how they're related, and it doesn't even explain which causes which thing. Because what we see is basically, well, let's say that you get the information that every time I clap my hand, there's a sound coming. And they occur at the same time. You can make two assumptions here. You can either assume that every time I hear the sound, I clap my hands. Or you could assume that when I clap my hands, the noise occurs. So just by having the data points that they always occur at the same time isn't the same thing as explaining their relationship. Or it doesn't, just knowing that they happen at the same time, it doesn't explain what it is about me clapping my hands that makes the noise appear. When we look closer to this thing, it's because we realize that when I clap my hands, the air is vibrating. I create a vibration in the air, and that travels through to my ears, and I pick up sound by vibrations in the air, basically. So this problem has been explained, and we've debunked the fact that, or relatively so, that it's not that I hear the sound that I clap. I mean, you can compare this to Pavlov's dogs, who he trained that every time he rings a bell, they get food. So when they hear a bell, they get saliva stimulation. And then that's to when they hear a sound, they get a physical reaction. In the case with clapping my hands, it's when I clap my hands, the sound appears. So it could hypothetically be either way. It depends on how much data we have of it and if we have what kind of model we use to make sense of it. Well, in the hard problem of consciousness, we don't have that. And the reason it's central is because in our modern day, we kind of assume that we start with an external world that is our primary way of knowing. And then our consciousness arises out of this world. But that is not really the case, because the way our primary experience is happening inside of consciousness. We've never had any experience that has happened outside of consciousness. And the way I can describe this is that sound, for example, can be measured, and it can be described as having certain amplitude or certain wavelengths. But when I hear sound, I don't experience it as a certain amplitude or a certain wavelength. I experience it as music. So it's quite a big difference between data about a sound and the experience of listening to a sound. So basically, all we've ever experienced have qualitative, is qualia. Mm, how do I explain this? Like, the feeling of being in love, the experience of thinking about my childhood, the seeing of the color red. I don't experience them as anything other than qualities that arise within me. But if I want to explain to you how, um, let's say I hear a bit a beep. In order to explain my um, my experience to you, the qualitative experience, I can choose to use quantities, and quantities are things like how heavy, how big, what dimensions, how does it vibrate, does it have any spin, things that we can measure basically. And then I can give you all the data points about this sound that I'm experiencing, and then you can recreate that, and you get the same qualitative experience of the sound. But neither one of us use the quantities to do the experiment. We just use them as a way of describing between us. Does that make sense, or did it confuse a bit more? Let's see if I can make it a bit more simple. If you're scientifically schooled, or just by living in this Western world, you've been a bit trained to see the world in quantities. You talk about wind speed and temperature, but those are just way to explain to each other what it's like to feel a summer breeze against your skin. Feeling a summer breeze against my skin isn't a certain wind speed and temperature. That doesn't capture the experience I have. It just tells you how it's measured. So the question is, how is it that something that can be measured as wind speed and temperature is experienced as something completely different? How does number on the feelings, the perception, how do they correlate? And that is the hard problem of consciousness. And some people think that if we just stay at it long enough, we will eventually map it out. We will understand it, kind of like we did it with DNA. We found out the alpha helix and the way it's structured and the way it folds itself. Before we didn't know how life was kind of coded, but then we found DNA and it explained so much to us. And it took a major leap in how we understand biology and genetics. And some people think it will be the same with the hard problem of consciousness. But other people, me included, transparent with that, think that we will never be able to solve the hard problem of consciousness because it isn't a hard problem. It's a wrongly phrased question because it already makes an assumption. It makes the assumption that consciousness do arise out of our complex nervous system. And then we've already assumed that this is the case. So if you question those fundamental principles, then the question itself kind of collapses. If you do not think that our conscious experience arises out of this material, lifeless world that comes together and forms a complex nervous system, And then that gives rise to consciousness at some point, and the question becomes irrelevant. And what's the argument for that, or how is that seen differently? And that's the other way around. Because with the hard problem of consciousness, you start with an external world and ask, how does my inner world arise out of the external world? But you could also rise and say, well, the first thing I ever experienced when being born was my inner world. So my inner world must be primary. So then the question is, or it must be primary. Let's start with what we know firsthand. The only thing I can be certain of is that I have an inner world, or rather, I am experiencing. Something is conscious. That is my first and most primal experience, being aware. And if we start there, then it's not so certain that we even have an external world. We don't have anything that's made of matter, that's out there, that's created by lifeless particles or even vibrations. You could still be part of materialism or physicalism. But if we start with the fact that I am aware, not necessarily that we end up in the question of how does consciousness arise out of matter. We might actually end up in the question like, how does the illusion or how does the appearance of an external world, of what we call matter, how does a table or a tree arise out of my consciousness or consciousness as a whole? And then we get a completely different question. It's no longer a problem to explain how consciousness arises out of matter because we don't assume that's the case. And if I can give some examples to this, it could be like, let's say you see the sky, a blue sky, and then you have some clouds inside of it. Or there's some clouds on the sky, and there's two ways to formulate a way of understanding this. Either you can say, oh my gosh, how did these clouds create the sky? How did the sky emerge out of the clouds? Or you could ask, how did the clouds appear in the sky? How did the sky give rise to clouds? Those are two completely different questions. And if you don't know which path to take, then you have to back up even more. Then you have to kind of ask, which is primary here? Which is always there? Until you know which of those questions are the right question to ask, there's another question before. And another way of explaining it could be that, imagine that you're going hiking. I'm going to this beautiful mountain, and you get handed a trail map. And either you can ask, oh wow, how was the mountain created based on this map? How did that happen? Or you could take the perspective of, how is the map created from the mountain? You see that they're correlated. You see that if there's a trail on the map, there seems to be a trail on the mountain as well. And the same with consciousness and the apparent external world, or what we see as a world out there made of something else, because that's usually our experience, that it is made of something other than thoughts or than emotions. But that doesn't mean, just because my inner world is usually made out of emotions and thoughts, something I cannot catch with my perception, that doesn't mean that the world out there is necessarily made of something other. It could be another form of conscious manifestations made out of consciousness. But this episode is not, I'm pretty sure it filters through what my opinion is, but it's not really designed to convince you as the listener of one thing or another. What I'm trying to point at is the challenges that occur with the hard problem of consciousness, and what it's actually trying to formulate, and why it is so relevant for our discussion around consciousness. And also why we can't just let it go, because if we agree that this is a problem, this is something we discussed, then we've kind of already gone into discussion where we have made assumptions that haven't been proven by science. Science has not or proven. Science can't prove anything really. It can more disprove something, but it's not supported to a large extent by science that consciousness do arise out of matter. So as long as we keep focusing on the hard problem of consciousness, we might actually back up the tape and see where could we have taken a wrong turn, or where have we made assumptions that hasn't quite been substantiated by what we see in science, or how we have tested out our assumptions. Yeah, and maybe we've come to the age where consciousness, our understanding of consciousness, is becoming more and more relevant because, well, I find this fascinating anyway, because we're moving into an age where it's not really clear what is conscious and not. When AI is entering the scene more and more, the discussion of whether an AI is conscious or not becomes highly relevant. Because up until now, we've kind of said like, oh, if it looks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Meaning that if a creature can show emotions, and if they seem to make decisions, it probably has consciousness, like a cat or a bird or a human. Now we have machines all of a sudden. They act superhuman, but is there consciousness in there? Or how does this actually work? They don't have a nervous systems like we do. They don't have any metabolism. What is consciousness really? So for me, we're entering quite an interesting era in this discussion of what it means to be alive, basically. And the hard problem of consciousness is very central to that. Well, I think that's all I had to say about this subject. Did it make sense? I have no idea. Did it make sense to you? If you have any comments or any questions, please do comment below. And if you find content like this interesting, please remember to subscribe as well. Thank you for this moment.